Sandwiched between Russia and Sweden, Finland is ranked the happiest country in the world. Historically, however, the country is very young, with its people having struggled and ultimately thrived through centuries of wars, famines, and general destruction. So how was this cold northern land forged into the country it is today? That is what I'm going to explore with this film, made with support by Rautaportti, Irongate Armory. This is the history of Finland. And now play the intro. But for now, let's go back to the beginning. Whether Finland was inhabited by humans before the last ice age, we don't know, as the ice sheet ground and wiped away any traces of human culture. The so-called wolf cave has been suggested as a home for Neanderthals some 120,000 years ago, although this is no longer supported by most scientists. If the wolf cave proved to be a true dwelling of Neanderthals, it would be a significant discovery. The first trustworthy signs of human habitation appear around 8800 BCE, as the ice sheet recedes. The map looked very different at the time, or would have looked had there been maps around, with the shoreline further back inland than it is today. The shoreline is also where people mostly lived, but would move seasonally, following the movements of game animals. They hunted, for example, moose, beaver, and seal, and kept domestic dogs. The Proto-Finnic language was not a thing yet, so the speech balloons are not authentic, in case anyone was wondering. This period is called the Suomusjärvi culture, which was followed by more cultures of confusing names, which we will mostly leave out in order to not die of boredom. For perspective, it was around this time that the first cities started to appear in the Middle East. Very few artifacts from Finland survive from this period due to the hostile soil. Coincidentally, not much can be said for sure about the beliefs of the people either. Some of the older Finnish creation myths are very similar to those found in North America. So it is likely that the primordial myths of the Finns and some Native Americans share common origins. The remains of Stone Age burials indicate no beliefs of life after death. So we can say that Tuonela, the realm of the dead, was yet to be established. Placing objects in graves became common later on. The Stone Age lasted relatively long. From around 2800 BCE onwards, a new god arrived in Finland. If you watched this channel before, you will hopefully have heard of him. I'm of course talking about Ukko himself, who would later be considered the most important of pagan Finnish gods. He was introduced by the corded ware culture that spread to southwestern Finland from the Baltics and is also called the battle axe culture, which, I think we can agree, is a much more memorable name. It is no coincidence then that Ukko's weapon is a hammer axe, much like the tools of the period. Ukko would divide his godly duties with Ilmarinen, the previous sky god, who later became associated with iron. He also added the position of a heroic blacksmith to his resume. As agriculture spread and the lifestyle became less nomadic, Ukko took on the duties of guarding the harvest and weather which the harvest depended on. The so-called giants' churches on the shores of the Bothnian Bay were built around 3000 to 2000 BCE. This is roughly the same time as the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt and the Indus Valley civilization was born in Southeast Asia. The giant churches were not built by the battle-axe people, nor do we know what they were used for. Theories range from fortresses, offering sites, seal meat storages, to astronomical observatories. The buildings tend to have the doorways facing the direction of sunrises and sunsets of equinox and solstice days, much like other megalithic constructions around Europe at the same time. The battle axe people might already have practiced slash and burn agriculture. This cool-sounding technique means burning down forest in order to create farmland. With this method, the soil will only yield crops for a few years, which means constant migration. The slash and burn farming prevailed in Finland far into the 19th century. It is also thought that it was during the time of the battle axe culture that the presumed proto-language diverged to the ancestors of modern Finnish and Sami languages. Or so it was thought previously. Nowadays it's assumed that Proto-Finnic arrived from the south and east around year 0. While we cannot prove that the practice of shamanism was a thing, researchers assume that Finnic peoples used to practice it as well. The shaman was a powerful figure who could communicate with and travel to the other world. That more or less concludes the Stone Age in Finland at around 1500 BCE. The Stone Age was followed by, as you might guess, the Bronze Age, although it initially changed very little in Finland. One small change, however, is that the quality of pottery went down as metal tools made woodworking much easier and preferable over clay. The Bronze Age in Finland starts with the High King Seppo Kalevanpoika wielding a bronze sword and conquering the land. That put an immediate stop to the use of stone tools, and the Bronze Age had started. Well, not really. The use of bronze tools and weapons started spreading to the area of present-day Finland around 1500 BCE. We like to name these different eras Stone Age, Bronze Age, and so on, but it's not like the appearance of a new material suddenly ended the use of the previous. And such is the case with the turn of the Stone Age to Bronze Age. Unlike stone and later on iron, the ingredients for bronze, copper and tin were not easily available in Finland, and the metal was mostly imported. Because of the trouble of resourcing it, stone tools prevailed along metal for a good while. And it's only fitting then that stone was one of the first metal bands in Finland, among the early pioneers of what would develop into an internationally renowned music scene. It would, however, take a while before metal became mainstream culture, so at first the beginning of the Bronze Age saw very little change in people's lives. Climate change, however, had shrunk the population, and fewer sites of human habitation are known than from the Stone Age. Nor have they discovered a great number of bronze objects. With the changing climate, the flora and fauna changed as well. The nowadays common spruce spread successfully while the number of mammals in the woods dropped, as did the number of seals, which were important game animals. Just like the Stone Age, people still lived close to waterways and good hunting and fishing grounds. International trade, although international is not the right word, as nations hadn't been invented yet, started to grow, centering around bronze and amber. The trade network spread not only across the bay to Sweden, but all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. The Bronze Age culture was different in eastern and western Finland, with agriculture being more prominent in the west. The west was more heavily influenced by its Scandinavian connections, while the east was more connected to the Bronze Age culture in modern-day Russia. Houses became more and more permanent, usually appearing as single houses, but occasional groups or villages are known too. Some defensive hill forts were already in use during the Bronze Age, which suggests larger cooperation or small society than a single village could manage. Slash and burn farming was the common farming method. Farmed crops included barley and wheat, and cows, sheep, goats and pigs were kept as domestic animals, while dogs were kept for hunting purposes as well as companions. The animals would have looked a bit different back then, maybe something like this, I don't really know. The Bronze Age likely saw major changes in people's beliefs as the spread of agriculture and permanent settlements required new kinds of deities compared to a pure hunter-gatherer society. The harvest became more and more crucial for survival, and Ukko would take on the role of its protector, although when exactly I cannot say. Further evidence of changing beliefs comes from new burial customs. Burial mounds or barrows start to appear, as well as burning of the bodies later on. The burial mounds called hiidenkiukaat start to appear around the turn of the Stone Age to Bronze Age, along the coastline which was more closely in contact with the Scandinavian Bronze Age peoples. Some of these mounds, but not all by any means, contain objects. Similar mounds but in rectangular shape are called church floors, and similar mounds deeper inland are called Lapland's ruins. Lapland, or Lappi, used to mean wilderness, more or less. Burying the dead under heavy stones could indicate a desire to prevent the dead from returning to harass the living. Such beliefs were common later on and have been well documented, but of course with the Bronze Age we cannot say for sure. The graves were often built gradually, first for one member of the family and later to be expanded with more bodies. The word hiidenkiuas means roughly troll's stove, as in the stove of the sauna. Hiisi, however, was originally not a troll but a sacred place. As one might guess, the church tainted this word later on to describe a malicious creature. And I guess it's the latter hiisi which gives its name to the burial mounds. Bronze was of course precious, and the ownership was likely limited to people of high status and wealth. As the existence of the large trade network suggests, the Bronze Age people went to great lengths in acquiring it. Bronze objects were, however, not only imported but also crafted locally. The imported swords and daggers that have been found are similar in design to weapons in Europe, as the metal culture in Finland only started to take unique shape later on in the Iron Age. We don't know much about the language, but it is thought that the Baltic Finnic languages started to take shape and diverge into Proto-Sami and Proto-Finnish, according to Ilari Aalto, contrary to what I said in the Stone Age episode. Aalto further explains that the Proto-Sami was the first of the two to spread to most of Finland, which explains Sami place names even in southern Finland. That more or less concludes the Bronze Age at around 500 BCE. As I said earlier, little change initially compared to the Stone Age, and the division is maybe a little artificial. The Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age are, for that reason, sometimes called the Early Metal Age. Think Black Sabbath, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. The age when Vikings terrorized places across Europe and beyond was similar in Finland. The Finnic peoples did their fair share of raiding and trading with and against the Scandinavian Vikings. Finland was also far more prosperous than previously thought, with extensive ownership of the highest quality swords of the time. The Viking Age is known as the Late Iron Age in Finland. But before the Late Iron Age, it is only logical that there was an Early Iron Age, and that's where we should start the video. The use of iron started to spread into Finland from the east around 500 BCE. Unlike the previously introduced bronze, iron made a big difference in people's lives. It was available in the Finnish soil in lakes and bogs and wasn't necessary to import. So the metal culture spread rather quickly across Finland. Taro sentenced Stratovarius, impaled Nazarene and Amorphis were among the important early bands. After the migration period in Europe, the Finnish metal scene started to truly take a unique shape. Weapons and jewelry developed their own styles and the music was heavily melodic. The use of bronze didn't end, of course, but focused more on jewelry than weapons and tools. Iron, as a lighter and sturdier material, was game-changing for agriculture and warfare. And it is at this point where farming became the dominant livelihood in the south and west, while hunter-gatherers, including the Sami, prevailed deeper inland. Because iron was such a game-changer, it also heavily affected the beliefs of the time. The birth of iron appears many times in ancient runes, and the metal was given supernatural powers. Iron tools or weapons, when hung on top of doors and windows, would repel trolls. The god Ilmarinen, also descended from the skies, added credits for its forging to his LinkedIn profile and became the blacksmith Seppo Ilmarinen. Life didn't end with death, or so we can assume based on the rich burials which included weapons and other objects needed in the afterlife. The dead could also return to harass the living, and possibly for this reason the swords placed in the graves were sometimes broken. Or it could also have been simply to prevent grave robberies. The cemeteries were often sacred places, many of which were later on largely defiled and destroyed by the church. Burials were at first lit AF until Christian habits of coffins started to slowly gain foothold. The new religion spread slowly both from the Catholic Church after the conversion of Scandinavia, as well as from the Orthodox Church in the East. The Finnic tribes, however, largely remained pagan during the Iron Age, empowered by Väki, the omnipresent spirit or power. One of the first written accounts of Finnic peoples is in Germania by the Roman historian Tacitus around 98 CE. Whether he actually referred to ancestors of modern Finns, Sami, or some other people, we may never know, but the Proto-Finns theory has been suggested by Professor Juha Pentikäinen. Another Iron Age mention is from the Anglo-Saxon poem Widsith that is sometimes interpreted to mention a mythical Finnish king Kaleva. Although some of the old bronze trade routes died during the Iron Age, trading didn't end by any means. Furs were the most important export product, and the Vikings' eastern route all the way to the Black Sea passed by the Finnish coast. It was a stop along the way and a likely place to ask for directions for navigating the rugged archipelago. The interaction between the different peoples wasn't always sunshine and rainbows. Runestones and sagas tell of Viking raids to Finland that ended in bloodshed. Networks of hill forts were in active use during this time, and the people apparently used them with great success in defending against raids. The saga of Olaf Haraldsson says, "They sailed to Finland and plundered there, and went up the country. All the people fled to the forest, and they had emptied their houses of all household goods. The king went far up the country and through some woods, and came to some dwellings in a valley called Herdaler, where, however, they made but small booty, and saw no people. And it was getting late in the day, the king turned back to his ships. Now when they came into the woods again, people rushed upon them from all quarters, and made a severe attack. The king told his men to cover themselves with their shields, but before they got out of the woods he lost many people, and many were wounded, but at last, late in the evening, he got to his ships. The Finlanders conjured up in the night, by their witchcraft, a dreadful storm and bad weather on the sea, but the king ordered the anchors to be weighed and sail hoisted, and beat off all night to the outside of the land. The king's luck prevailed more than the Finlanders' witchcraft, for he had the luck to beat round the Balagard side in the night, and so got out to the sea. But the Finnish army proceeded on land, making the same progress as the king made with his ships. Despite the previous being a mythical saga, we can say that the Finnic tribes were often more than capable of repelling attackers. It is worth noting that there was no national Finnish identity yet, nor would there be for centuries, but rather tribes that spoke an early form of Finnish. and they fought against each other too. The larger hill forts could have served as centers of government as well, although we can't say for sure. The lack of written evidence does not mean that something couldn't have existed, and it is likely that chieftains or petty kings ruled over several settlements. What is interesting and still relatively ignored, although I try to push it in my videos, is the huge number of Iron Age swords found in Finland, which is a big deal as swords were invaluable at the time and a sign of power and wealth. Many so-called Ulfbert swords have also been found. It was like an iPhone or Ferrari of its time, with the exception of the Ulfbert swords actually being useful. The strong presence of swords paints an entirely different picture of Iron Age Finland than the common idea of mud-dwelling savages, which was deeply rooted in people's minds during the later Swedish rule. It was of course a tough time to live compared to modern times. The climate, although slightly warmer than today, was harsh and survival took a lot of effort. Both men and women played an important role in the daily tasks, and this potentially led to greater appreciation of women in Northern Europe. The houses were wooden, built both with horizontal logs as well as earth-covered stave frames. They typically had only one room with a hearth in the middle for cooking and heating. There were no chimneys, only small vents where the smoke would escape slowly, and a thick cloud of smoke by the ceiling. Farming, hunting and foraging were typical daily tasks. Besides the previously introduced domestic goats, pigs, dogs and sheep, horses started to appear during the Iron Age. The clothing was nothing like what we see in modern TV shows. No studded leather and biker vests. The clothing was made of wool, linen, hemp, furs and nettle. Wealthier people would include extensive jewelry and more colorful fabrics. Because the people didn't own piles of fast fashion garbage like today, the clothes were higher quality and made to last. Speaking of historical clothes and equipment, I would like to thank Irongate Armory for supporting this video. From historical arms and armor to everyday items and literature, they supply a number of history enthusiasts such as myself. I have been a customer for over 10 years, so this is not a typical ad read of a sketchy mobile game or a VPN provider, but I can actually recommend the shop. With the caveat that of course you have to be aware of what you're buying and for what purpose, since their stuff ranges from LARP and fantasy gear to more historical items. The stuff, however, can help with any questions. And as an introductory offer, you will get 10% off with the code HistoryOfFinland25 until the end of the year. In the year 1066, the Viking Age ended, so all the Vikings hung their axes and shields on the wall and retired. This, however, wasn't the case with Finland and Finnic peoples. Raiding, typical of the Viking Age, remained a popular hobby well into the period of the European High Middle Ages. Across the bay, the Swedish tribes had started adopting a new faith, Christianity, and abandoning their old beliefs. Slowly but surely, Sweden would also consolidate herself into one country with a ruling monarch. Flipping their Thor's hammers upside down and adding a Jesus didn't seem to stop their thirst for raiding, however. It merely added an element of religious conversion to the popular and fun activity. During the Viking Age, Scandinavian Viking settlements were scarce inside Finland. From the 1100s onwards, however, the Swedes started to increasingly colonize the Finnish coast. Their rule became stronger over centuries, and much of today's Finland was consolidated into the Kingdom of Sweden. In medieval and later texts, the colonization is dubbed as Crusades against the pagan Finns. This is, however, largely propaganda and mythical history, created to justify the rule of kings and the church in the Middle Ages. According to the traditional lore, the Swedes launched 3 crusades into Finland from around 1150 to 1293. The first crusade, led by King Eric the Holy, who was accompanied by Bishop Henry, was a well-known tale since the Middle Ages and similar to other European martyr legends, typical Christian propaganda. According to this legend, the king launched a crusade against the Finnish pagans, and the bishop remained in Finland, establishing the local branch of the Catholic Church. He was then brutally murdered by the Finnish pagan Lalli on the ice of Lake Köyliönjärvi, which earned him the title of Finland's patron saint. Apparently the bar for Catholic bishops was low, as getting murdered as an invader was considered an achievement. Same thing with the biblical figure Noah, who, according to the Finnish translation, was considered a decent man for hanging his back on a rack when he went into the sauna. There is, of course, no proof that either of the legendary characters ever existed. Bishop Henry and Lalli, that is. Well, there's no proof of the biblical Noah either. Nevertheless, they have remained popular for centuries. Interestingly, the murderer Lalli, whose name is ironically of Christian origin, transformed through centuries from an evil pagan barbarian into a patriotic hero who resisted foreign conquest and gods. Of the legendary Crusades, the third one can be said to have taken place for certain. Archaeological evidence as well as place names suggest that not only Swedes but also Danes and potentially Norse and German invaders did their share of this violent tourism as well. So the Crusades to Finland can be seen as a part of the larger campaign of the conquest and conversion of the heathens of Northern Europe. A special pat on the shoulder and seal of approval goes to the Lithuanians for remaining the last pagans in Europe, officially converting not until 1387. We don't know many details of how exactly the church and the new faith gained foothold. Black metal songs tend to portray it as brutal, violent oppression and slaughter. And the church did certainly destroy old pagan shrines and build churches on top of them. Pope Alexander III's letter from 1171 or 72 to the Archbishop of Uppsala heavily complains about the pagan Finns mocking the Christian faith and trolling the church. They would pretend to be good Christians when threatened with the sword, but immediately afterwards they would harass the priests and make fun of their religion. On the other hand, archaeologist Ilari Aalto argues that the church likely cared little about the beliefs of individual Finns, as long as that area could be counted as Catholic in the books. Christian beliefs were gradually adopted and added to Finnic paganism. It is likely that Jesus, Jehovah, the saints and other confusing Christian gods took their seats in the pantheon with Ukko, Tapio and others before partially replacing the pagan deities. Jehovah and Ukko probably influenced each other and got eventually mixed up. The worldview of a slowly Christianizing Finn was quite different than that of the Christians in southern Europe or the Crusader states. The masses were held in the local language, not Latin like the common myth says, and the clergy used familiar pagan terminology to explain foreign concepts. The underworldly punishment, for example, was dubbed Tuonela after the Finnish realm of the dead and hell in Germanic areas. Countless traces, or I don't know, maybe someone's counted them for a university thesis, of old pagan words in the Bible can be found in its older translations. For example, giants have been dubbed Kalevanpojat after the mythical primordial Finnish giants. It should of course be noted that there was no Finnish nation or identity at this point. People likely identified as members of their family or village. For the sake of convenience though, I gather the Finnic tribes living in present-day Finland under the umbrella of Finns in these videos, and you just have to deal with it. The Swedish grip of the country got stronger as the time passed. The Swedish-speaking settlers were given privileges over the Finnish population, as they also largely formed the ruling class. The Erik Chronicle, which is the oldest surviving Swedish chronicle by the way, describes the Swedish Crusades to Tavastia and Karelia. It is assumed that the Hammock Castle was built following the Crusade. The construction of castles helped to reinforce the Swedish rule both against the Finnish tribes as well as the Novgorodians from modern-day Russia. The Novgorodian chronicles also describe multiple deadly conflicts with Finnic tribes from the 11th or 12th century to the early 1300s. The Erik Chronicle also describes the Karelians looting the Swedish town of Sigtuna in 1187. It is also said that they repeated this fun activity in Sweden in 1257. While editing this, I have to add that while these events sound cool, the evidence for both is scarce at best and close to non-existent. These would be used as grounds to launch the Third Swedish Crusade into Finland against the Karelians in 1293. This bloody trip was followed by the construction of the strategic Viborg Castle, allegedly by the orders of Marshal Torkel Knutsson, Lord High Constable of Sweden. The raids among the Finns, Swedes and Novgorodians would go on regardless until 1323. That's when Sweden and Novgorod got so bored of the bloody business that they drew a line on the map, defining the borders of both realms for the first time. This is known as the Treaty of Göteborg, and it ends the Crusade era and marks the beginning of the Middle Ages in Finland. After the legendary Crusades and settling of the Swedish colonizers, the Finnish Middle Ages are on. The Iron Age tribal society with petty kings was slowly replaced by the rule of the Swedish lords and the church, although it may not have affected the daily lives of people that much. Finland proper, Tavastia and Karelia, and central Finland formed the eastern part of the Swedish kingdom that was called Österland, Eastland, from the 14th century onwards. So let's take a trip to the Finnish Middle Ages. One of the most iconic images of medieval Europe is the stone castle. Such was the case in Finland too. These impressive structures served, besides giant symbols of power and means of defense, also as residences of the local lord and centers of government. Sweden was divided into castle fiefs, Österland into 8, ruled by a steward who would collect taxes, deliver justice and maintain the defense of the area. A crucial distinction between Sweden and much of Europe is that Sweden did not develop a feudal system, although they had knights. Nor were the peasants serfs forcibly tied to the land like in much of Europe. The peasants and farmers made up most of the population. Other estates included the rälssi, formed by the nobility and clergy who were exempt from tax, and the tongue-twisting bourgeoisie, essentially a medieval kokoomus, a wealthy class running the business in cities. The Middle Ages are often referred to as the Dark Ages, and this goes for Finland too. For the average farmer, though, life was much better than in the 1600s, right after the Middle Ages. The most important city and seat of the Swedish rule of Österland was Turku. Porvoo, Viipuri, Ulvila, Rauma and Naantali were smaller cities, all located along important waterways where rivers meet the sea. The cities were run by a council of the bourgeoisie. While trade happened largely in towns, countryside was the breadbasket of the country. Österland had a population of around 200,000, and Turku, the largest city, had around 1,500 people, which shows the importance of the medieval countryside. The peasants mostly owned the land themselves, unlike later in history. A wealthy peasant could even advance to the frälse by mustering and maintaining a mounted man-at-arms. The countryside consisted of small agricultural villages. Slash-and-burn farming was still common, although not the only method. The villages were very self-sufficient, as buying anything was expensive, and trade was officially only permitted in towns. The farmed crops varied between the west and east due to different climate and culture. Traditional Iron Age clothing prevailed longer in eastern Finland, while European and especially German fashion gained foothold in the west and in the cities. The medieval peasant's diet was perhaps surprisingly healthy. Broad beans and peas were common sources of plant protein, while cereal, that is bread, porridge and pottage, was the base of the diet. Hunting and fishing, of course, provided additional nutrition as well as ale, which was low in alcohol and high in calories, and generally much safer to drink than water, especially in the cities. The same food was often eaten on set days of the week, a habit that is still preserved in the form of pea soup on Thursdays, in Finnish schools and military. The food was often pickled, salted, smoked or cured to preserve it. People kept domestic animals like sheep, chickens and goats, but mostly for their milk, eggs and wool, as slaughtering for food was not economically sensible. Meat spoiled easily, and peasants ate it mostly during the kekri and Yule feasts, when the animals were slaughtered. The clergy and nobility were more wealthy and thus more carnivorous, as is pretty much always the case in history. Their feasts in the castles and manors could also include imported wine, which was very sweet by today's standards. Medieval lord's meal could include both savory and sweet dishes at the same time, as the modern concept of desserts hadn't been invented. Eating roast chicken with honeycakes would have been normal for them. How did people get around? Most of the country was still wilderness. The sea level that was low after the Ice Age was receding, and ships could no longer sail upriver in many places like in the Viking Age. Roads were built to connect major towns and castles. The so-called Tavastian oxen road from Turku to Hämeenlinna is still partially intact and can be hiked. Summer and winter were the best seasons for traveling, as the roads were in better condition. In the winter, the waterways froze and could be easily crossed with skis or sleighs. Bandits troubled journeymakers in Europe, and while they did harass people traveling across Finland too, wild beasts of the forest were probably a more common nuisance. As the pagan beliefs remained strong, mentioning the bear's name in the woods was out of question, as it would summon the beast. The best travel insurance was moving in larger groups and carrying a spear and crossbow. Taverns served travelers along major roads. In the towns there were also alehouses and public saunas that might have offered prostitution services after dark. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people didn't only bathe once a year, although the towns were quite filthy with litter on the streets. Bathhouses and saunas in Finland were a common sight. The downside was that while they were effective in maintaining hygiene, they were also effective in spreading disease, with the most famous epidemic being what else but the Black Death. It seems, however, that Finland was spared from its first wave in the 1340s. While under the Swedish rule, German influence was strong, especially in the cities. The Hanseatic League of merchant guilds and market towns controlled the trade in the Baltic Sea, doing business in Österland as well, often harassed by pirates. German was not an uncommon language to hear in the cities along Finnish, Swedish and Russian, according to Olaus Magnus's description of the northern peoples. The language of the clergy was Latin, and the Sami spoke, unsurprisingly, Sami languages. The Middle Ages was a relatively decent period to be alive in the history of Finland, or so we concluded the previous episode. Now it's time to shatter that illusion and take a moment to talk about the key events of the Middle Ages. Those include war, wrath, death, and slaughter. Let's go. The violent late Iron Age saw the Finnic tribes in a constant battle against the Novgorodians and each other, as well as against the Norse and Swedish tribes. The warfare was typical for the Viking Age: quick raids against the enemy settlements, often looting and burning the entire place down, stealing any valuables and enslaving the survivors. Sweden was slowly forming herself into a kingdom, although that can be said to have taken centuries. From the 12th century onwards, they started increasingly colonizing the western coast of today's Finland. They would also slowly convert the Finns to Christianity, at least formally. Heathen shrines had to make way for the churches. The oldest known medieval stone church of Ravattula in Kaarina was built at the turn of the 12th and 13th centuries. That is shortly after the Pope Alexander III's letter from 1171 to the Archbishop of Uppsala complaining about the pagan Finns opposing the church. They would pretend to be good Christians when threatened with the sword, but immediately after they would harass the priests and make fun of their religion. In the same spirit, the town of Sigtuna in Sweden is said to have been looted in 1187 by Finnic pagans. Speaking of towns, the oldest town of Finland, Turku, meaning marketplace, is said to have been founded in 1229. It became the largest and most important city of the eastern part of the realm. The first bishop of Finland with reliable records supporting his existence was Thomas, reigning from around 1220 to 1245, during which the Swedish nobles fought for the throne. According to another papal letter, Thomas's reign saw increased cruelty by the heathens, likely the Karelians, Novgorodians, and much of Tavastians. This resulted in economic sanctions and a ban on trade with them. This, of course, was no good news to Novgorod, and Prince Yaroslav II allegedly launched an attack into possibly Tavastia in 1227. This was then countered the following year by a Finnish force of 2,000. They failed miserably. The Tavastians and Bishop Thomas were keeping busy. Pope Gregory IX's 1237 letter describes a rebellion of heathen Tavastians in southern Finland. The Pope spares no detail, writing that small children who have been shown the light of Christ through baptism, they violently tear away from this light, slaying them. The adults, after pulling their intestines out, they sacrifice to evil spirits. Priests they make blind and brutally cut off their hands and other members. Papal letters again reveal a call to arms against the heathens bordering Norway. Apparently, though, the church moved next not against the Tavastians but Novgorod. The eastern enemy of the Swedes and Finns was weakened by the Mongol invasion, and the Swedes took advantage of it. Or so it is thought, based on the Novgorod First Chronicle. It describes a naval force of Swedes, Norwegians, Finns and Tavastians being slaughtered on the river Neva by the Prince Alexander in 1240. The reliability of the account is questionable. The Tavastians didn't get to rest for very long. Jarl Birger of Sweden launched an invasion into Finland in the mid-1200s. The Erik Chronicle, written almost 100 years later, calls it a crusade. Whether it actually took place or not, it is around this time that the Swedish colonization of today's southern Finland gets a boost. In 1250, Finland's first monastery was founded in Turku, followed by the Cathedral School, the first of its kind in Finland, in 1276. The Swedish rule was of course not only strengthened with religious buildings, but with stone castles as well. Turku Castle led the way, its construction starting around 1280, perhaps simultaneously with the Turku Cathedral, which would become the base of the Catholic Church in Finland. Häme Castle followed shortly after. It is worth noting that some Iron Age hill forts were still in active use or even constructed during the Middle Ages, but they became obsolete as Sweden's grip of the land grew stronger. Around this time, 1280, both the nobility and the church were made exempt from taxes. Wealthy peasants could rise to the tax-free nobility by supplying and maintaining a mounted man-at-arms. In 1293, the Marshal of Sweden, Torkel Knutsson, led the Third Swedish Crusade into Finland, according to the Erik Chronicle. This fun excursion was aimed at the Karelians, who had been a constant nuisance with their raiding and looting. The crusade was a success and was followed by the construction of Viborg Castle, now the easternmost outpost of Sweden. Despite the success, Knutsson fell into disfavor with the king and was executed in 1306 in Stockholm. The clergy must have gotten jealous of the erection of castles and decided to build one for themselves. The now ruined bishop's castle in Kuusisto was a handsome seat for the bishop and an impressive fortress, just as Jesus would have liked it. The castle seemed to have little effect on the constant bloodshed with Novgorod. The Finnish Bishop's Chronicle mentions the Novgorodians burning down the city of Turku and looting its cathedral in 1318. The violence and destruction seemed to lose popularity among the rulers of Sweden and Novgorod. This led to them signing the now famous peace treaty of Göteborg in 1323, permanently ending all violence between the two realms. Just kidding. With peace formally on the paper, it was time for another kind of struggle for Sweden. In 1350, the Black Death arrived in the realm. This devastating epidemic killed up to half of Europe's population. Finland was, however, spared from its first wave. In 1364, the Swedish Civil War was fought on Finnish soil too. Turku was besieged and finally surrendered to the king after suffering heavy damage. Finland was practically ruled by the immensely wealthy Marshal Bo Jonsson. During his reign, the Finns were granted representation at the King's Moot in Sweden. For unlike most of Europe, the Swedish kings were elected at the time. In 1389, King Albert of Sweden was beaten by Queen Margaret of Denmark, following a war that was part of a Scandinavian Game of Thrones. The Danish forces besieged Stockholm, but it was supplied by the Victual Brothers, the infamous pirates in the Baltic Sea that had business in Finland as well. Margaret took control over most of Sweden, leading to the formation of the Kalmar Union, lasting until 1523 and including Sweden, Norway and Denmark. In 1398, the victual pirate captain Sven Sture surrendered Korsholm Castle to the crown. Another clarification from the editing table is that apparently Mr. Sture didn't personally hold the castle, as has been kindly pointed out to me. The pirates were largely destroyed by the Hanseatic League, which ruled the trade of the Baltic Sea, and the leaders were executed and their heads displayed on spikes. The Kalmar Union was mainly governed by the Danish rulers. They were more interested in the matters of the southern Baltic Sea and competing against the Hanseatic League. This turned the Swedish faces sour, as their interests laid primarily in the Novgorodian issues. However, this series is about the history of the Finnic peoples in today's Finland, rather than Scandinavian Games of Thrones. Back to Finland then. Turku was buzzing in the 1400s. In 1409 they started minting their own coins, soon followed by the establishing of a legal court, and then it burned badly in 1429. The 1434 Engelbrekt peasant revolt against the King of Sweden spread into Finland as well, involving the siege of Kastelholm Castle. The capturing of castles is a recurring theme, as Rautaportti Castle was taken over by pirates in 1437, soon to be taken back, however. More peasant revolts took place, this time in southwestern Finland and Karelia. The same year, a Brigittine abbey was established, the first in Finland to accept women. In general, 1400s saw many new construction projects. Perhaps the most visible was the construction of St. Olaf's Castle against the threat of Novgorod. It was Finland's most modern medieval castle and the first to feature roundel towers designed for the age of gunpowder. It would come in handy very shortly. In 1478, Novgorod was swallowed by Moscow, and Moscow was not happy about the Finnish settlements spreading beyond their 1323 borders. A war was fought that resulted in no change to the borders, but caused a lot of destruction in Finland. It is no wonder that it would become known as the Old Wrath in Finnish. Robert Brandberg cites the Finnish peasants' writings of their suffering. They burned, beat, murdered, and tormented our wives, our poor children, and those men who fled. They took our wives and children and took them to Russia. The men they take and hang upside down by their feet, light a fire underneath them, scorching their hair and beard. After this they put them down, place a fiery container on their chest, and burn the flesh from their bodies. They then tie a rope around their heads and twist a stick against their heads so tightly that it pops their eyes out. They then cut open their bellies and make them walk around trees as long as their intestines run. From some they tear off their beards and then behead them. Our poor wives they hang from their hands, beat with whips, cut off their nipples, stab with spears and torment to death. They take our poor children, impale them on fence poles while alive, and then shoot them full of arrows. They carry all the children into a house, lock them in and burn them. Should someone make it out, they stab them with spears and throw back into the fire. Such accounts are anything but rare when it comes to Finland's history with Russia. We won't go into details again in the series, but it felt important to give a good idea at least once. The turn of the century saw the Kalmar Union starting to break for good. This manifested itself in wars which spread into Finland too. Turku and Porvoo, for example, were burned. Well, this video has taken a really dark turn now. The turn of the 15th and 16th centuries was a turbulent era of unrest in Finland. The Middle Ages was ending as the Finns would slowly awake to the dawn of the modern age. The dysfunctional Kalmar Union was breaking, with Danish forces repeatedly laying waste to Sweden, including her Finnish territories up to Tavastia. The eastern border was also aflame. The Old Wrath, which we covered in the previous episode, left a pile of corpses and destruction behind, but failed to resolve the border disputes between Sweden and Moscow. In February, Christian II of Denmark marched to Stockholm and had himself crowned King of the Union. He had invited the nobility to Stockholm, promising to pardon his opponents. They swallowed the bait, and Christian had them imprisoned and performed a separation of the heads from the necks of his male opponents at the city square. This would be known as the Stockholm Bloodbath and was done to intimidate the Swedes into submission. Turns out it had the opposite effect. The Swedes rose against the Danish king, led by the nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father was one of those executed in Stockholm. By 1523, King Christian was dethroned after a bloody war. Gustav Vasa was crowned King of Sweden, and Österland, that is Finland for those who haven't been paying attention, was declared part of Sweden again. This marks the end of the Middle Ages in Finland. The next roughly 100 years are known as the Vasa Age. This era saw a bunch of changes that modernized the country. So what changed for the average farmer then? Initially, not that much. They still formed the backbone and breadbasket of society, farming and eating pottage, typically the same food for each day of the week. This custom is, by the way, carried on to this day in the liquid form of pea soup on Thursdays. A few years prior, a German priest named Martin Luther had stomped on the Pope's feet with biblical aggression. His aim was to reform the Catholic Church, which he found greedy and corrupt. Although it was likely not Luther's goal, what he set in motion left much of Europe soaked with blood and in ruins, involving the Swedish armies with their Finnish forces as well, but more about that in the next episode. Like much of the state under Vasa's rule, the church underwent reformation. This meant shifting power and wealth away from the church and to the king. This suited the king just fine. The bishop's castle of Kuusisto was demolished, ridding the church of its military throne. It also involved making the church more accessible to the people according to the Lutheran principles. This included translating the Bible into Swedish and Finnish. The man for the task was called Mikael Agricola, Bishop of Turku and a student of Luther himself. He is often known as the father of written Finnish, and this is mostly true, as his ABC-kirja was the first book published in Finnish. It is likely, though, that priests and other literate Finnish speakers had been writing notes for themselves in Finnish before Agricola, but none have been preserved. In the preface of his Bible translation, Agricola lists the pagan gods of Tavastia and Karelia. While the list is by no means an accurate depiction of paganism at the time, it is evidence of surviving heathen beliefs well into the reformed Lutheran Finland. The growing realm needed a history for its people, so one was made up. The Swedes and Finns claimed to descend from biblical heroes and ancient civilizations. This, of course, was nonsense, but that was not important. In addition to the new literature, the first detailed map of the Nordics was published in 1539. It was called Carta Marina and created by the Swedish cartographer and clergyman Olaus Magnus. In the map's southern end of Finland, King Vasa founded Helsinki in 1550 as a competitor to the buzzing trade hub of Revolt, known today as Tallinn. Much to his disappointment, though, Helsinki was built in the wrong place behind a poorly navigable archipelago. Founding cities is cool, but what would an episode of this series be without wars against Russia? As we remember, the Russo-Swedish border was long disputed, and raids by and to both sides were common. This escalated to a full-blown war in 1555, known in Finnish as the Great Russian War. Although the Finnish ski troops are best known from the Winter War hundreds of years later, Sweden used them to great advantage under the command of Juho Maununpoika. Sweden besieged and failed to capture the strategically important Oreshek castle, and their advance towards Moscow was halted. Rumors of Ivan the Terrible mustering a massive force for counterattack spread, and the Swedish-Finnish army retreated. In January 1556, the Russian forces flooded into the Karelian Isthmus, killing everything in their way, but failed to capture Viborg. A truce was reached with no formal changes to the border once again. Not that it mattered much, for another war was fought in 1570 to 1595, known in Finnish as the Long Wrath. On Finland soil it was largely guerrilla warfare associated with the legendary warlord Pekka Vesainen. Russia was also fighting Polish, Lithuanian, Danish and Norwegian forces, which suited Sweden well enough. A peace treaty was signed in 1595, and this time it included redrawing parts of the map, with Sweden gaining areas in northern Estonia and Finland, whereas Russia got its hands on Ingria again. While the farmers were ravaged by war, the nobility were tasting the flavors of the Renaissance, which had finally reached the north after emerging in Italy a couple of centuries earlier. A key figure was the Queen Catherine Jagiellon and her Renaissance court in Turku Castle. As you can imagine, all the fighting had taken its toll on the Finnish peasants. Besides the heavy taxes ordered to fund the wars, they were required to host and supply the armies even after the war had ended. The nobility, on the other hand, benefited from the wars as they gained new territories and loot. Meanwhile, the king Sigismund fought for the throne against his uncle Charles. The governor of Finland, Klaus Fleming, was a supporter of Sigismund. Charles promised to relieve the peasants of the burden of hosting the armies in order to gain support for his fight for the throne. Fleming responded by strengthening his iron grip of the country and terrorizing the peasants. The situation kept getting more and more perkelefied, and the peasants had had enough. By the end of 1595 they took up arms, led by a nobleman named Jaakko Ilkka. Their revolt and marching south inspired the mustering of similar peasant armies across the country, but they were no match for Fleming's heavily armed and trained troops. Two of the Civil War's numerous battles ended with the Swedish army promising to pardon the rebels, immediately slaughtering them after they laid down their arms. After crushing the rebels, Fleming's armies plundered the countryside in the spirit of fairness. The King Sigismund, whom Fleming supported, was dethroned by Charles, who then conquered Finland and killed much of the Finnish nobility loyal to Sigismund. The mass execution of political opponents starts to sound familiar at this point. The wars had left the Finnish population weak, and this was not helped by the Great Famine of 1601, which spread death and disease across the land. The warm climate of the early Middle Ages had cooled, which certainly didn't help. Luckily for the Finns, though, they got to enjoy permanent peace and prosperity ever since. Just kidding. What followed was even more wars and death, as Sweden rose to be a great military power. By the 1600s, Sweden was no longer a small, irrelevant kingdom. The internal power struggles of the Swedish nobility were over, and the Finnish peasant revolts crushed. The neighboring realms around the Baltic Sea, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, and the Holy Roman Empire, however, were still eagerly playing the Games of Thrones, which Sweden had already finished. Taking advantage of this, Sweden rose to be a great power in Europe in the 17th century, often called the Swedish Empire. And it is this period which we will cover in this episode. Welcome. The beginning of this era started in 1611 with the 16-year-old King Gustav Adolf rising to the throne. His and his successors continuous reforms to both the administration and military made Sweden a formidable realm among European powers, despite the small population and backwoods location. What did this mean for the Finns then? Well, they were arguably largely neglected when it came to the reforms, although the period of Per Brahe the Younger is often seen favorably, so who knows. On the other hand, they did get to enjoy more of their peace and precious personal space for a century, as the wars were fought on foreign soil, sparing their homes from constant destruction for a change. The vast majority of Finns were still farmers, which, together with the trading bourgeoisie, formed the bottom class of society. The bourgeoisie, for whom I still don't know an easier word. Above the commoners were the clergy and finally, of course, the nobility. They adopted the over-the-top Baroque fashion, again following European trends, although their influence was smaller in Finland. Laws forbade inter-class marriages, and people's behavior in general reflected their social class. Another European trend of the 1600s copied in Finland, especially in Åland and Bothnia, were witch hunts. Although folk magic was still very common at the time, we know of no more than 100 death sentences from the 1600s. In the spirit of European absolutism, the power of the king and central government were strengthened. This meant that the farmers in the remote corners of the realm had less control of their local decision-making. So their position and standard of living arguably decreased compared to the supposedly dark Middle Ages. Still, some peasants inherited and owned the land which they farmed, and by supplying a mounted soldier for the king's army, they could get tax reliefs and less burden from forcible conscription. It was a real pain for a farm if the working-age men left to fight in distant lands, with no guarantee of when or if they would return. Speaking of war, we'll get to that soon. But first, a few words about the Church, which, if you remember, had been turned from Catholic to Lutheran and was controlled by the Crown. Besides its Lutheran religious mission, it was tasked with the job of teaching literacy, which would slowly improve in the country. Education was in general improved with the founding of schools and the Royal Academy of Turku. The strict Lutheran identity was also a convenient weapon against the Orthodox Russians or Catholic Germans and their allies. Which brings us to the raging battlefields of the 30 Years' War, which, for the sake of this video, I will oversimplify as a conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The scale and destruction of the war is hard to comprehend today. It left millions of corpses behind, combined with the resulting diseases. And as its name might suggest to the brightest minds, it lasted 30 long years. Sweden entered the party in 1630, and the Swedish intervention was key in changing the course of the war in favor of the Protestants. The Swedish army was cleverly modernized by Gustav Adolf. As described by Mikko Laakso in the book Hakkapeliitoista korpisotureihin, Adolf's artillery and cavalry were lighter and mobile, and the entire army well coordinated. It was designed to break the formations of the Catholic League fighting in the Spanish and German fashion. Around a third of the army consisted of Finnish troops, who in turn often formed the majority of the cavalry. These horsemen have later achieved somewhat of a legendary status in Finnish history, known for their close-range charges and war cry. While the Finnish farmers formed a large part of the conquering armies, they didn't enjoy the spoils of war, unlike the nobility who had pretty much turned Swedish by this point. And as always, the growth of the kingdom could mean more power and wealth in their pockets. The conflict-ending Peace of Westphalia has often been seen as a starting point for the concept of sovereignty, meaning that other states are not allowed to mess with the affairs of others, which in some twisted way sounds funny to modern ears, as we might take it for granted depending on where we live in the world. Sweden only took part in the 30 Years' War for 5 years, but as so often in history, continued to fight back and forth against the neighboring countries. It could be said that all this fighting left the economy underdeveloped, although some new cities including Oulu, Vasa and Kokkola were formed around the tar business, Finland's major export. Speaking of exporting, Sweden adopted mercantilist principles. The idea was that there's a limited amount of money and wealth in the world, and more of it has to come into the country than what leaves the country. However, as I've probably said dozens of times now, most people got their livelihoods from farming. And as a country so up north that agriculture was on the verge of being worth it at all, Finland was highly vulnerable to bad weather and crop failures. And bad weather and crop failures indeed occurred for 2 disastrous years in a row in Europe. With the king's focus on wars, a famine swept across the land, leaving piles of corpses behind. Partly due to the mercantilist economy, food could not be bought even by those who could afford it in the second year of the hunger, as explained by Mirkka Lappalainen in the book Jumalan vihan ruoska. Up to a third of Finland's population died of hunger and the resulting diseases, which makes this one of the worst naturally occurred famines in recorded history, with a scale of devastation directly comparable to the Black Death in the Middle Ages. News of the disaster still traveled rather slowly, and in fact, the state administration thought that people died on purpose in order to avoid paying taxes. Meanwhile, Sweden's enemies had not been idle. By 1699, Denmark, Norway, Russia, Poland and Saxony had formed a powerful but loose alliance, which led them to the Great Northern War, ending the Swedish Empire. Because as history shows us time after time, every empire will fall and every monument crumbles. Actually, that's Empire Falls by Primordial. What a great band. Anyway, as is the case with empires, Sweden too had bitten more land than it could chew, especially with the weakened teeth of a small, famine-ravaged population. Although Sweden saw initial success on the battlefield, their advance towards Moscow was halted. Which sounds familiar to anyone who's into military history. The following Battle of Poltava saw nearly the entire Swedish army captured or annihilated. The following decade, the crumbling Swedish realm was playing defense. Their enemies pushed further into the Swedish-held lands, including the Russian occupation of Finland, which, as you can guess or probably know, was not a great time for Finland. In fact, so strong is the significance of its horrors that we will leave it to the next episode. Meatballs with mashed potato is a cornerstone of Nordic cuisine. This simple, filling dish is a favorite of both the old and young, and I'm sure many of us have fond memories of this all-time classic. So this episode starts with what else but a story of how meatballs were introduced to Sweden and consequently Finland. After Sweden's army got crushed in a devastating defeat in Poltava in 1709, the King Charles XII escaped to the Ottoman Empire, where he reportedly fell in love with meatballs and later brought the food to the north with him. For the Finns, however, the aftermath of the battle was anything but cozy meals with meatballs. With the army badly beaten at Poltava, there was hardly anyone left to defend the country. With the fall of Sweden, Russia established itself as the dominant great power in the Baltic region and swept across Finland, leaving behind a trail of blood. This period, 1714 to 1721, would be known as the Great Wrath, and I really wonder who comes up with these names like Great Famine and Great Wrath, as they were both fucking awful. I have said before in this series that we will not go into the details of the horrors of war again, so here's a general idea of how the Great Wrath was. The Russian army systematically destroyed as much of Finland as they could. The orders from the Emperor Peter the Great were to ravage the Bothnian coast so that Sweden's forces could never again advance eastward from there. Cities were burned to the ground, their populations massacred, raped, and children enslaved. The violence was more brutal the further they advanced and peaked in the region of northern Bothnia. Before mass murder, mass torturing in the cruelest ways imaginable often took place. Such practices have a dedicated word nowadays: genocide. Whoever could flee across the Gulf to Sweden would. This was more achievable for the higher estates, and the peasant's fate was to try and hide in the woods, trying not to starve. It is often said that the Finns' generational caution towards the East, labeled as Russophobia by the Kremlin propaganda machine, has much of its roots in the Great Wrath. It is also often considered the darkest era in Finnish history. So in contrast, everything that comes afterwards in these videos is sunshine and rainbows. And indeed, the battered post-Great Wrath country saw some reforms, a key one being the Great Partition, Isojako, which replaced the medieval open field system Sarkajako, in which each house farmed a narrow strip of land in a tightly built village. Now the small and scattered patches of fields were merged. This resulted in significant increase in production and also wealth. But it also effectively ended the concept of a village, which led to the decline of the use of sacred springs, hills, and other places, according to Anssi Alhonen of the Taiwan Naula organization. It may have been in the interests of the ruling class to keep the peasants further from each other, so they wouldn't congregate and come up with any undesirable ideas. And it also made me think that combined with the presumed caution following the horrors of the Great Wrath, this could have contributed to our introvertedness to this day. What do you think? Share your thoughts and prayers in the comments. As I have said countless times in this series, and it still applies, that most of the people were farmers. While the Great Partition often benefited the land-owning peasants, it greatly increased the number of non-wealthy tenant farmers, torpparit, or as I like to call them, freelance farmers, who rented a hut in a nobleman's or peasant's land and mainly paid the rent with labor. And while many a peasant found himself in a better position, they also bore the weight of the allotment system, ruotujako. A few houses formed a file, ruotu, and equipped one soldier for the military. The soldiers of the era wore the iconic blue greatcoats with yellow cuffs. This Carolian fashion remained in use even after the Carolian era itself ended. As far as I know, which is not incredibly far, more like a few kilometers, the houses of the farming population, that is, most people, were still wooden cottages. That was, however, considered inappropriate for the increasing amount of wealthy manors, priests' houses, and public offices in the cities. There, the fashion changed in favor of stone buildings, the building of which was even subsidized. It might not have been just the elite's taste that drove it, though, but also concerns about the supply of timber for the military-industrial purposes. The extravagant manors were decorated and furnished lavishly in the neoclassical Gustavian style from the 1780s. The name came from the King Gustav III, famously assassinated at the opera. One important figure from this era is Anders Chydenius, a priest, politician, and the leading classical liberal in Nordic history, sometimes nicknamed Finland's Adam Smith. Often said to have been ahead of his time, his achievements include the liberation of the tar business in Bothnia, which brought increased wealth to the region, as well as the world's first Freedom of the Press Act in 1766. Speaking of important dudes, another is Henrik Gabriel Porthan, whose work laid the foundation for this channel, among other things. On a side note, this is Tero Porthan, one of my favorite artists, not least because of the style and subject matter. He's often titled the father of Finnish history, as he delved into Finland's history and folklore with attention to proper source criticism. That was groundbreaking at the time of Gothicism, which sought to prove the Swedes' descendants from biblical heroes or some connection between the Finnish and Hebrew languages. Porthan was also heavily involved in the first ever newspaper published in Finland, which ran for 14 years. In 1776, while the American 13 colonies were fighting for their freedom, the first ever Finnish-language newspaper, Suomenkieliset Tietosanomat, was printed but ended its run the same year.
Ettei ulottuvaisia ostajia tulevan vuoden aiottuihin tietosanomiin ole nyt ilmestynyt, niin täytyy niitten ulos antamisen kanssa seisahtaa joksikuksi ajaksi.
Let's add a third important dude to the list. That would be Kristfrid Ganander, another priest and collector of invaluable folklore. His 1789 Mythologia Fennica, published with Porthan's help, was a piece of inspiration for the compilation of Kalevala and later scholars of Finnish mythology. And I think it's about time that an up-to-date book on the subject was made, illustrated by yours truly. Publishers, find the right people to write it and let's make it happen. Finland had its share of the 18th century Enlightenment too. Literature had been predominantly religious up to this point, but now reading novels started to emerge as a new form of entertainment. It should be noted, however, that this was a hobby of the upper classes and the books wouldn't be in Finnish yet. Dissatisfied with the king's absolute power and consequently the loss of Sweden's status as a great power, the estates ruled the country from 1720 to 1770, the so-called Age of Liberty. This led to each estate mostly advancing their own interests. The hats and caps were major parties with opposing views. And that's what they were indeed called. The hats gained the majority of seats and started a war against Russia in 1741. And you can guess how that went. The War of the Hats ended with what else but the Russian occupation of Finland. This time, however, it didn't last that long and the systematic violence and terror was milder, giving the period the Finnish name of the Lesser Wrath. The first proper census of the realm was conducted in 1749, counting 2 million residents, of which 400,000 in Finland. This number was an unpleasant surprise to the rulers, who preferred to keep it secret in order not to attract any foreign invasions to the sparsely populated country. In addition to reducing Russian invasions, the life expectancy was improved by improved healthcare. In 1756, it was mandated that every province should have a university-trained physician, or doctor as we say. They were also actively pushing for better hygiene. An interesting detail about that is how the physicians and midwives started to promote breastfeeding to reduce infant mortality, instead of using dirty horns that would spread gut infections and kill the babies. Qualified midwives were trained in Stockholm, and it is the first official vocational qualification for women in Finnish history. This is again tied to the census and the government's concerns about growing the population. In the meantime, Russia had taken Sweden's place as a great power in Europe and around the Baltic Sea, as Sweden's small population was inadequate to supply cannon fodder for constant warfare. And when we talk about European history, constant war was pretty constant. By the early 1800s, Napoleon's France was at odds with Britain, among others. Napoleon forced much of Europe into a continental blockade against the UK, with Russia taking part as well after suffering a crushing defeat against Napoleon's forces. Sweden, on the other hand, was very fond of Britain, or at least the lucrative business with them. Napoleon, of course, was not fond of this relationship and ordered Russia to force other countries to join the blockade by any means, including war. So Russia attacked Finland in February 1808. Sweden's strategy was to withdraw towards Oulu while delaying the enemy and then launch an offensive in the summer with reinforcements from Sweden, which was a total disaster. In the spring, the supposedly invincible sea forts of Svartholm and Sveaborg surrendered, with Russian forces once again marching across Finland. This was possibly quite a surprise for the Emperor Alexander I, whose goal was nominally only to force Sweden to join the blockade. Blockade. How is it? Turns out he was able to annex Finland to the Russian Empire. And this is where the era of Swedish rule in Finland ends. Sweden's 600-year dominion of Finland was over. Finland was now in the hands of Russia and the Emperor Alexander I. The last couple of times that Russian armies had swept across Finland featured murder, pillaging, and annihilation. In contrast, this occupation was much nicer. Afraid of the Finns longing for their former Swedish overlords, as well as the threat of Napoleon of France, the Russian Emperor granted Finland privileges, including autonomous rule. This period from 1809 to 1917 is known as the time of autonomy in Finnish, with Finland being a grand duchy within the Russian Empire. And the name is not used without reason. To separate Finland from the rest of the empire, a customs border was created, and unlike during the Swedish rule, taxes collected from Finland were spent on Finland. The hated allotment system of the military was abolished. Territories previously lost to Russia were returned, including the important city of Viborg. Swedish laws were retained, as well as the estate's privileges and the Lutheran Church. This likely helped to calm down the Finns' fears of forced conversion, as Alexander I was known as a strict Orthodox. And this would be a good opportunity for a church joke, but I've run out of them. These turned out to be smart moves from Russia, as the occupation following the war was relatively bloodless, and the Finns would become stable, loyal subjects, until they weren't. More about that towards the end of this episode. Let's not forget, though, that despite the speedy recovery, the death toll of the Finnish War was high, especially since the civilians had to supply both armies. History was also partially rewritten, with the previous Great Wrath severely downplayed. For more reading in Finnish about the early 1800s history, I recommend tätä Pia Einosen ja Miikka Voutilaisen kirjaa Suomen sodan jälkeen. The small town of Helsinki was made the capital city, being further from Sweden and closer to St. Petersburg and protected by the Sveaborg sea fort, which, ironically, had kind of proved to be useless by surrendering to Russia a few years prior. Speaking of capitals, we like to call Turku the old capital of Finland, but at the time we refer to, the realm was ruled from Stockholm and no separate state of Finland existed like the Grand Duchy of Finland. So I argue that Helsinki is, in fact, the oldest capital of Finland. We can fight about it in the comments. The initial effects of the new ruler on the people were insignificant. The top of society consisted mostly of Swedish-speaking estates, nobility, clergy, burghers, and land-owning peasants. The majority of people, roughly translated as peasantry, fell outside of the estates. This peasantry included non-landowning farmers, laborers, and beggars. Finland was still a poor country where struggling to make ends meet was common. And as you can guess, the poor didn't have much of a say in matters. Only the estate sent their representatives to the Diet. Why it's called Diet in English, I don't know. The Diet was not assembled once between 1809 and 1863, however. And the power was in the hands of the Senate and their appointed officials, giving this period the nickname of the Age of Bureaucracy. Finland was not the only nation to have autonomous privileges under the Russian Empire. Poland, for example, had a similar situation, against which they revolted in 1830. The uprising was crushed and Poland's autonomy gone as a result. This was probably noted in Finland, and the people remained loyal to the ruler when they could have taken advantage and risen up. For example, during the Crimean War against the UK, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Its battles in Finland are called the Åland War. And the Åland War was terrible.
Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!
When with 300 ships the Englishmen sailed along our Finnish shores. According to a song, anyway. As I've said in pretty much every episode of this series since the Bronze Age, Finland was still an agrarian society, with the vast majority of people being farmers. Industrialization started relatively late. The father of Finnish industry, James Finlayson, opened Finland's first modern factory in Tampere. And there are a lot of technological innovations and firsts to lists for this period, and I will probably fail to include most. But let's mention the first Finnish railway from Helsinki to Hämeenlinna, opening in 1862. In western Finland, settled agriculture, meaning permanent fields, were the dominant practice, whereas the ancient slash-and-burn farming still persisted in the east. While the 1800s saw new tools, machinery, and methods, the farming was not very effective, and poor harvests could mean famine. Which brings us to the last great non-human-made famine in Europe. Which is a messed up thing that there are extreme human-made famines in history. Besides that honor, I want to remind you that one of the most devastating famines in recorded history also occurred in Finland some 160 years earlier. Known by its creative name of the Finnish famine of 1866-68, this disaster killed some 8 to 10% of the population, that is, 150 to 200,000 people. Poor harvest in a few consecutive years, preceded by the destruction of granaries in the Åland War, led to a food shortage. This was amplified by the government's inability to react accordingly. They thought that providing unconditional aid would corrupt the nation's morality, much like the previous Great Famine, during which they thought people died on purpose to avoid paying taxes. Many of us remember grandparents stuffing us with food when we were kids, with biblical determination. But if you think about it, their own grandparents were survivors of the Great Famine, so our own grandparents would have heard first-hand accounts and trauma of people starving to death and boiling shoes for food. Quite a difference only a few generations back when compared to the Moomin-shaped Finns of today. Following the famine, the amount of beef cattle was increased. Feeding on grass, they were more resilient to the harsh climate than weather-dependent crops. Previously, cattle had mostly been kept for not even the milk but manure. How do you say that? Manure. But it was still insufficient for proper fertilization of the crops. This shows how Finland was almost too far north for agriculture and how devastating even a small change in climate is. Despite the famine, Finland's population grew from 1 million in 1812 to 2 million in the 1880s. Child mortality was still high but combated by the smallpox vaccine. It is only fitting then that as the nation's population grew, so did its spirit. Nationalism was booming in 19th century Europe. Finns too started to seek their own identity. As an early nationalist figure, Adolf Ivar Arvidsson reportedly said, "Swedes we are not, Russians we wish not to become, let us then be Finns." Russia was accepting of it, as they hoped it would distance the Finns from Sweden. Besides Arvidsson and the compiler of Kalevala, Elias Lönnrot, Johan Ludvig Runeberg was an important influencer of the time. He not only gave his name to one of the best pastries in the world, developed by his wife Fredrika, but also wrote epic poetry of the Finnish War. He would later rise to the status of Finland's national poet. Although he wrote in Swedish, considering Finnish inferior for culture, which I find funny for a nationalist poet looking at it from a modern perspective. The 1800s also saw the publication of the first ever Finnish language novel, Seven Brothers by Aleksis Kivi, which was published in 1870, which I find very late for a language with a rich rune-singing tradition as recorded in the Kalevala. Now with Finnish prose finally a thing, Minna Kant was the next significant author of the time. Titled Finland's first feminist, Kant's realist work often dealt with social issues. Unlike Runeberg, Senator Johan Wilhelm Snellman worked to promote the Finnish language. In 1863, Finnish was pronounced equal to Swedish in all matters which touched the Finnish population. By the way, the Russian emperors during the Finnish Grand Duchy era are easy to memorize. Just use a banana. Or that's what Finnish kids were taught at school. Nikolai II, as the Emperor of Russia and Grand Duke in Finland, ended the aforementioned nice and chill era of Russian rule. His goal was to Russify Finland and other minorities in the empire, and this is known as the Years of Oppression in Finnish. This led to widespread opposition by the Finns, and the first era of oppression ended with the murder of Governor-General of Finland, Nikolai Bobrikov, and the general strike of 1905. The following year, Finnish women were the third in the world to get the right to vote, and the world's first female members of parliament were elected in 1907. This era, not least because of the oppression, would become known as the Golden Age of Finnish art. Besides painting, it also saw the first ever Finnish fictional film, Salaviinan polttajat, no copies of which unfortunately survive to this day. Shortly after, the second oppression period started, aiming to undermine Finnish legislative powers. This led to the formation of the Jäger movement, Finnish volunteers training in the German military during the First World War. They did not, however, need to fight to free Finland from Russia, as Russia's 1917 revolutions created a favorable situation for Finland. With the colonizers in chaos, the Finnish parliament declared themselves the wielders of the highest power, followed by the Declaration of Independence, accepted by the Parliament on the 6th of December 1917. The date would be celebrated as Finland's Independence Day. Much could have gone differently, but the newly enthroned Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin accepted Finland's declaration. Oversimplifying the following months a little, shortly after, other nations recognized Finland's independence. So now, for the first time in history, Finns had a country of their own. It all went smoothly from there, with cakes and rainbows the next year. With Finland finally independent, the country ended up in what many freshly independent countries end up in: civil war. The Declaration of Independence was already not unanimous, and the tensions rose between the right-wing government and the workers' movement and Social Democratic Party. The parliament failed to agree on a force of law enforcement, leading to both sides forming militias, white and red guards, which kept arming and radicalizing, ultimately leading to the start of the Civil War in January 1918. In history, civil wars are often labeled as exceptionally brutal because it's one nation fighting brother against brother. Well, such is the case with the Finnish Civil War too, and it remains a sensitive subject to this day. The decisive battles were fought in the spring of 1918, with the bloody Battle of Tampere being a turning point in favor of the Whites, who won the war with the support of Germany, while Russia supported the Reds. The war was brutal, but even more so was its aftermath. Thousands of Red prisoners died in prison camps shortly after, and the nation was deeply divided. After crushing the Reds' revolt, the Whites worked to turn Finland into a kingdom, with the German emperor's brother-in-law on the throne. Germany's defeat in the First World War put an end to these plans, and Carlo Juho Ståhlberg became the first president of the Republic of Finland in 1919. Continuing with the war theme, the following years saw Finnish volunteers taking part in the so-called kinship wars, with Finnic peoples seeking to break out of Soviet Russia. A notable result of these conflicts was Estonia's independence. Estonian history is in general intertwined with ours, but it is also unfortunately largely outside of the scope of this video. Nowadays, Estonia is seen somewhat as Finland's little brother, but especially during our prehistory, that is, before the Middle Ages, a great amount of material and cultural influence reached today's Finland through Estonia. Finland's borders remained largely the same as during the Grand Duchy era. The Åland Islands were given to Finland with the decision of the League of Nations, despite the population being dominantly Swedish speakers. The tragedy of the Civil War was followed by what I would describe as a great success. The policies of the 1920s improved equal opportunity and softened the tensions between the former Civil War enemies. Progressive taxation was introduced, and the tenant farmers were given the right to own land. This essentially gave more people something personal to fight for, with the rising threat of the common enemy, the Soviet Union. The standard of living went up until the Great Depression, but its effect on Finland remained relatively small. Compulsory education was introduced, as well as compulsory military service. A much less successful bill was that of prohibition. Finns had grown very fond of booze, and the ban of alcohol resulted in widespread smuggling and black market, with the police confiscating 1 million liters of alcohol in 1930. I didn't find statistics of alcohol consumption before and during the prohibition, but I think it looks like the drinking did not exactly decrease, and alcohol-related violent crime reached an all-time high. An early building block of the Finnish welfare state was the creation of a modern pension system. The basic pension bill was passed in 1937, improving people's access to a decent standard of living. The pension system was and still is a gold mine for the post-World War II baby boomers. Not so much so for the younger generations. The Communist Party was banned following the Civil War, as well as most communist activities. The far-right Lapua movement, on the other hand, was gaining traction in the Bothnian region. Opposing communism and left-wing policies, they beat and kidnapped their perceived enemies in the so-called muilutus fashion. The movement kept on radicalizing and in 1932 sought to overthrow the government. They were, however, sung into the swamp by President Svinhuvud's speech on the radio and abandoned the uprising. Later the same year, Finland signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Being a reliable and friendly neighbor, this of course meant that the Soviet Union would not attack Finland. And indeed, in November 1939, Stalin's army didn't swarm across the border as per their deal with Hitler's Germany. This conflict, known as the Winter War, is perhaps the best known part of Finnish history. The underarmed and unprepared Finns fought off the invaders with remarkable sisu. Following the successful post-Civil War reforms, the nation stood largely united and empowered by what is known as the Winter War spirit. Other nations sent their thoughts and prayers and changed their profile pictures. Despite this, the superior numbers of the enemy drained the Finnish defense, and a peace treaty was signed in March 1940. Foreigners often amusingly disagree with this, but the fact is that Finland lost the war and was forced to give up territories despite maintaining independence. The defeat left the country depressed and angry. With the Second World War in full swing and Germany launching an invasion into the Soviet Union, Finland joined the offense in order to regain lost territories, with German troops invading Russia from Lapland. This would be known as the Continuation War, indicating how Finland was not pleased with the result of the Winter War. The Finnish offensive was at first successful, but with the tide of the war turning sour for Germany, the Soviet Union was able to focus more on the Finnish front, ultimately pushing back the invasion in the summer of 1944. Besides further territorial losses, one condition in the following Moscow armistice was driving the Germans out. The Finns started by kindly asking the Germans to leave. Stalin was not satisfied, and Finland was forced to take up arms. This would be known as the Lapland War. The casualties were only a few thousand on each side, but the disgruntled Germans burned and destroyed much of the north of Finland as they withdrew to Norway. With the World War II over, the Paris peace treaties had Finland cede more of Karelia, islands in the Gulf of Finland, Salla and Petsamo. Furthermore, Finland agreed to pay $300 million worth of war reparations in the form of ships, trains and such to the Soviet Union. I think that would be around 5 billion today, but don't quote me on that. While a significant proportion of Finland's war-torn economy was bound to these reparations, they have also been thought to have benefited the industry, forcing Finland to modernize its metal industry. Finland refused Marshall Plan money from the US, which helped to rebuild and create dependency on the US in Europe. The refusal was in order not to upset the Soviet Union. This attitude, later called Finlandization, defined Finland's post-war position in the following decades, walking on eggshells to avoid further war and allowing Soviet interests to influence matters in the domestic policy as well. This also challenged Finland's neutral position with the agreement of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance. basically requiring Finland to ask for Soviet military aid in the face of a Western invasion. Some relief to the ordinary people in the tense post-war years was brought by the 1952 Summer Olympics in Helsinki. The games were a success and a well-needed boost for the country. And boosted was the economy too, with for example the country's reconstruction and increasing exports to the Soviet Union and the West as the country was industrializing rapidly. I've lost count long ago of how many times I've said that Finland was still an agrarian society in this series. Well, by this point, that was no longer the case. Urbanization happened hand in hand with the economic growth, with the majority of the people living in cities by 1970. In the 80s, Finland had one of the highest standards of living, quite the contrast to the famine-ridden nation only a few generations back. The economy grew exceedingly fast as the Bank of Finland loosened the regulation of foreign credit money. This then backfired in 1991 with the credit bubble bursting and the country falling into depression, causing widespread unemployment and bankruptcies. The suicide rate grew alarmingly. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Finland finally felt free to join the European Union in 1995 and NATO in 2022. The former being the same year as the national ice hockey team won the World Championships, an event which has reached mythical proportions in our collective memory. At the turn of the millennium, Nokia had grown to be the largest mobile phone vendor in the world, and its significance to the country was great. Around the same time, Finnish metal bands were breaking through across the world with their distinctive sound. And as this series started with metal band related puns, I feel like this could be a good point to conclude it. Of course, in comparison with the Stone Age, we know so much more about the past 100 years, and I've had to leave out quite a bit to keep the production of this series manageable. So as always, feel free to add your thoughts and prayers in the comments. What did I miss? What could be expanded on or maybe made into a video of its own? This has been a long but very enjoyable process, and if you made it here from the start, well, maybe you can come up with better things to do with your life. But anyway, I'm very grateful. Huge thanks to Rautaportti Irongate Armory for supporting this video. And don't forget that with the code History of Finland 25 you will get 10% off until the end of the year. This has been the somewhat complete history of Finland. I have been Antti Palosaari and you have been someone else.